They say the hardest thing about losing a parent is the grief. The hardest thing I found was standing in a funeral home parking lot on a Tuesday in October, holding an envelope with my mother's name on the outside in handwriting that was not hers. The October air in Beckley came down cold and straight off the ridge. Linda was behind me. The hearse was still in the lot, and I was reading a document that told me, in plain language, that everything I had spent 11 months driving toward had been quietly redirected. What Roy Tanner did not know was that my mother had made a second appointment with her attorney, alone, 8 weeks before the end, without telling anyone. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge, where the steadiest hand wins every time. If you've ever given everything and got nothing back, this story is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. My name is Dennis Calloway. I am 62 years old. For 22 years, I worked as a shift supervisor at Appalachian Paper in Beckley, West Virginia, the mill on the south end of town, the one you could smell from the ridge on a wet morning. I retired 8 months before my mother's diagnosis, partly because my body had decided it was time and partly because I wanted to be available for her in whatever way she might need. She was 78. She had lived alone on Nolan Avenue since my father died in 2002, in the house where I grew up 3 blocks from the old rail depot, in a neighborhood that had gone quieter and smaller since the mill years. My wife, Linda, and I had been married 34 years. We lived 4 miles from Nolan Avenue, in a house we had paid off in 2019. Linda worked part-time at the school district office and knew my mother the way you know someone you have eaten Sunday dinner with for 3 decades, completely without performance. My mother's name was Ruth. She had been a practical woman, organized about money and documents in a way that people who had grown up without enough of either tend to be. After my father passed, I had driven to Nolan Avenue 2 weekends in February 2003 to reorganize her finances, consolidated 3 accounts, set up automatic bill pay for utilities and insurance, walked her through every statement. She had thanked me by making coffee and not making a fuss about it, which was how she thanked people for things that mattered. In the years after that, I paid her property taxes for 3 consecutive years, 2010, 2011, and 2012, when her fixed income could not cover both taxes and heat, and she would not ask for help unless I made it easy to accept. I cleared the gutters and sealed the roof on Nolan Avenue every October for 19 years, 1 week in a year, up on the ladder while she stood in the yard, and told me I was doing it wrong. I replaced her furnace myself over a December weekend in 2014, when the one she had was 30 years old and the repair estimate came back at more than the furnace was worth. I kept the receipts in an accordion folder in my home office, not as a record of anything, just because I am organized in the same way she was. When her diagnosis came back on March 7th, Ruth sat at her kitchen table and read the paperwork twice, and then put it flat on the table and said she supposed she had better make some arrangements. That was how she talked about large things. She made arrangements. She did not catastrophize. I told her I would drive her to every appointment, and she said that was not necessary, and I told her I understood and drove her anyway. The first Tuesday I picked her up was at 7:14 in the morning, cold and still dark, and she was already at the door in her good coat with her purse on her arm like she was going to church. Beckley Memorial was 38 miles. The drive took 47 minutes on a clear morning and longer in weather. I drove her every Tuesday and Thursday for 11 months, 94 round trips, 38 miles each way. I kept a log in a spiral notebook, date, treatment type, nurse on duty, how she felt on the way home. The notebook had 94 entries. She was usually quiet on the way home. I learned not to fill the silence. I kept a letter she had left with her attorney, Sylvia Crane, who had handled Ruth's documents since her early 60s. In the back of my mind, the way you keep something you know is there without needing to look at it. Ruth had mentioned it once, briefly, in July, on the drive home from what would turn out to be the 61st treatment. She said she had updated some papers with Sylvia and that everything was in order. I had nodded and kept driving. I had not asked what papers. It was not a conversation she was opening. Roy Tanner had arrived in Ruth's life 14 months before she died, introduced to his daughter at her church, and he had moved into the Nolan Avenue house 9 months after that. He was 66, recently widowed himself, and he had a son from his first marriage named Roy Jr., who lived in Morgantown and who I had met twice. Roy was not a bad man in any obvious way. He was attentive and present, and he made Ruth laugh, which I was grateful for. He was also in the house every day during the months I was working shifts before my retirement, and then during the evenings after treatments when I had gone home to Linda, and I understood later how much ground can be covered in a house during the hours when the person who built the relationship is somewhere else. My throat tightened the first time I drove to Nolan Avenue, and Roy answered her phone instead of her. He said Ruth was resting, and he would have her call me back. He said it the way a husband says it, automatically, without considering whether that was his call to make. My hands folded on the steering wheel at the stop sign on Coal City Road. I did not say anything about it. The will was read on October 14th, 3 days after the funeral, in the offices of Roy's attorney, a man named Gerald Cross who had a practice in Fayetteville, 20 minutes from Beckley. I had not known Ruth had changed attorneys. I had assumed Sylvia Crane was still handling her estate. I found out about Gerald Cross from Roy at the reception, when he mentioned the reading matter-of-factly, the way you mentioned a scheduled appointment. I sat across the table from Roy and Roy Jr. at 2:47 in the afternoon. Linda was in the waiting room. The will left the Nolan Avenue house to Roy for his lifetime, with reversion to Roy Jr. after. It left a savings account, $43,000, divided equally between Roy and Roy Jr. It left the furniture, the car, and the contents of the house to Roy. My name appeared in one place, a paragraph noting that I had received assistance with a car purchase in 2008 and a down payment contribution in 2004, and that these gifts were considered my share of the estate. My breath stopped. I didn't answer. The 2008 car had been a $6,200 loan, repaid in full in 18 months. The 2004 down payment had been $8,000, which my father had insisted on giving us, and which my mother had always known was a gift, not an advance against inheritance. These were not my share of anything. These were gestures from parents who had something to give at the time and chose to give it. Roy spoke after the reading. He said, quietly, that Ruth and he had talked about this at length. He said she had felt I had already received more than my share over the years. He said she had wanted to make sure Roy Jr. had a real start. Something in me turned over. I sat with that. He kept going. He said he hoped I understood it was not personal. He said Ruth had loved me very much. He said she had said so often. My hands went still on the table. I had cleared her gutters for 19 years. I had paid 3 years of property taxes. I had driven 94 round trips to a cancer treatment facility. I had retired early so I could be available, and I had been available every Tuesday and every Thursday, in every weather, for 11 months. I kept my voice steady. Roy Jr. said nothing. He was looking at his phone. Gerald Cross was methodical in the way of attorneys who are prepared for a reaction and are waiting to see which kind they get. He had a manila folder on the table, and he kept his hands on it throughout. I stood up at 4:01 p.m. I thanked Gerald Cross for his time. I shook Roy's hand because Ruth would have wanted me to, and because I had decided, sometime between the first word of the reading and the last, that I was not going to become someone she would not recognize. I walked out the parking lot. Linda was already there, having come through the side door. She looked at my face. She did not ask. I said, "Call Sylvia Crane." I had not been inside Sylvia Crane's office since 2014, when Ruth had updated her power of attorney. The office was on Eisenhower Drive, a low brick building with a parking lot that needed resurfacing and a waiting room that had not changed in 20 years. I arrived at 10:17 in the morning on October 17th. Sylvia Crane had been practicing estate law in Beckley for 31 years. She was 64, direct, with reading glasses on her desk that she never seemed to use. She told me she had been expecting my call since the 15th. She said Ruth had come to her on August 29th, 8 weeks before she died, without Roy, without telling anyone. She had come alone, by cab, which Sylvia noted because Ruth had told her dentist was her driver, and she had not wanted to involve him in this particular errand. Ruth had made 2 changes at that appointment. The first was a signed, handwritten letter to me, 3 pages, notarized at the bottom. The second was a change of beneficiary form for a $214,000 whole life insurance policy that Roy and Gerald Cross had not known existed. A policy Ruth had been paying premiums on since 1987, held with a Beckley insurance firm, with Dennis Calloway listed as the original beneficiary and never changed. Roy's revised will cover this estate. The insurance policy existed outside the estate entirely. Sylvia said Ruth had given her specific written instructions. The letter and the beneficiary form were to be held until after the will reading, and then delivered to Dennis directly, not through Roy's attorney. I had driven her to the 61st treatment the Tuesday before that August appointment. She had been quiet on the way home, which was not unusual. She had said, getting out of the car in the Nolan Avenue driveway, that she appreciated how I never made it feel like a burden. I had not known, until Sylvia told me, that she had spent the afternoon filing paperwork for my benefit. My hands folded on the table in Sylvia's waiting room while I waited for her to retrieve the envelope. Howard Pitts at the county probate office had already received the change of beneficiary documentation as a matter of record, filed at 3:31 p.m. on October 28th. The policy was uncontestable. It had been in force for 37 years, and the beneficiary designation was current. Something in me went very still, waiting for Sylvia's door to open. Some people are loudest in the room they built for someone else. My mother had built a quiet thing on August 29th, in a cab she took alone, without telling me. She had not been able to undo what Roy had arranged. She had been able to do this. Sylvia produced the envelope at 9:04 on a Friday morning, November 3rd. The envelope was white letter-sized, sealed with a strip of tape across the flap, and had my name on it in Ruth's handwriting. The R in Dennis was the same R she had used on birthday cards for 62 years. For a moment, nothing. Sylvia set the change of beneficiary form beside it without speaking. I opened the letter. 3 pages, handwritten on the paper she kept in the bureau drawer in the dining room. I knew the paper, pale yellow with a faint line. She wrote about the drives. She wrote about the spiral notebook she had seen on my passenger seat. She wrote about the morning I had replaced the furnace and come in for coffee with sawdust on my jacket and not mentioned the cost. She wrote about the gutters. She wrote about the February weekends in 2003, which she said she had thought about more often than I knew. She wrote that she had not been able to stop what Roy had put in place without making the last weeks of her life into a legal contest she did not have the energy for. She wrote that she had done what she could do quietly. She wrote at the bottom of the 3rd page, I always knew you'd be fine. That was never questioned. The question was whether you knew I knew. I set the letter flat on Sylvia's desk. My voice stayed level. I asked her to walk me through the beneficiary transfer process. She did. The $214,000 was transferred to my account on December 19th at 10:41 in the morning, which was a Tuesday. Roy Tanner called twice after the probate filing became public record. I did not return either call. There was nothing to say that the paperwork had not already said more clearly. Roy Jr. did not call. The Nolan Avenue house passed to Roy per the will. I drove past it once in November, on a Sunday morning at 8:17, and noted that the gutters needed clearing. I did not stop. In January, I had the spiral notebook, 94 entries, 11 months, 38 miles each way, framed behind glass. It hangs in the hallway at home, next to a photograph of Ruth in her good coat, taken in the driveway on a Tuesday morning the previous spring when the dogwood behind the house was in bloom. Dennis Calloway, 62 years old, and still the person his mother knew he was. 22 years at the paper mill. 94 drives to Beckley Memorial. One Tuesday in August when Ruth Calloway took a cab to an attorney's office alone and did the only thing she had left to do. The paperwork was filed. The letter was real. And she had never stopped knowing whose name belonged on it. Have you ever done everything for someone and found out after they were gone that they had seen it all along? Leave your answer in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.